Justice Now, and I'm chairing this webinar, which, as I said, is on how corporate trade deals have made the world more vulnerable to COVID. I'm joined by Nick from Global Justice Now, Sharon from Institute of Agriculture and Trade Policy, and Cecilia from Transnational Institute. I'd say a bit more about them as I get each of them to do a quick introductory presentation. But I was thinking, basically, these are three people that I turn to when I have questions about work on trade. These are the people who answer my questions. So I thought it'd be great if we had a webinar when they can answer some of your questions. We're going to talk about sort of the big picture of trade deals, the system that they help to underpin that has made us vulnerable to COVID. We're going to talk about one particular trade deal that's coming, well, it's happening right now imminently for the UK, which is the US-UK trade deal. And we're also going to talk about the worrying threat that corporations are actually going to use the pandemic itself as a justification for a wave of corporate court cases. So that's what we're going to talk through. First, I'm going to ask Nick. Nick's the director of Global Justice Now and a long-term trade campaigner, veteran of TTIP campaign, CETA campaign, years of campaigning. Nick, can you get us started on talking about, well, yeah, the question in the title, how has trade deals made us more vulnerable?
Definitely, and very nice there's so many people here. This is one of our most popular webinars to date, and I'm sure that's got something to do with the fact that chlorine chicken has been so much in the news. It was even, I noticed last night, it was even trending on Twitter, which is fantastic for campaigners on trade deals, and I'll explain why in my few minutes of introduction. But first of all, to say, look, we've been told for 40 years now, free trade is always and everywhere good. It can almost never have any bad consequences at all. It's definitely going to make society better. It's going to create more jobs, more growth, more choice, cheaper prices. There's nothing to dislike about it. And this clearly is a complete misrepresentation of what our global trading system is and does. Trade rules have actually always been about power and distributing power. Some countries do better than others. Some parts of an economy will do better than others. Some do very badly indeed from the kind of trade rules that we put in place. But specifically over the last 40 years, trade rules have absolutely fixated on liberalization and deregulation of the global economy. They have handed huge amounts of power to big business, big corporations, and to financial markets. They go well beyond what people normally think of as trade. Normally, it's, people think of tariffs, essentially, taxes paid on goods coming into a country. Actually, the trade agenda today is well beyond that. And has almost become the rules of the global economy. So all of the problems that we have with our global economy today, trade rules have probably got at least a little bit to do with those problems, with fomenting those problems. And that's a real problem for us because I'm sure, as most activists already knew, the global economy has made us desperately vulnerable over the last few decades, but coronavirus has really exposed that in all its horror. It's shown us how vulnerable this idea that the market always and everywhere knows best, just leave it to the market and good things will come to you, how untrue that is, how that logic has hollowed out our public services, has turned healthcare from a right into a commodity, has undermined the rights of workers we depend upon to keep us safe, and has given financial markets enormous power to discipline governments and undermine their ability to act in the public interest. And all of these things need to change if we're to find a just and equitable way out of the current economic and health crisis, if we're to deal with future pandemics, and there will be future pandemics, even more so if we continue down this route, climate change will obviously exact an even higher cost on humanity than this pandemic, a much higher cost. Inequality is out of control. And if we want to deal with all of these things, we need fundamentally different set of rules. Now, you're already hearing politicians and experts talk about the need for more trade liberalization to get us out of the economic crisis we're in. For me, that's like, in 2008 saying you actually need to give the banks and the financial sector more power in order to deal with the financial crisis. I mean, it's completely the wrong medicine. And we need to start thinking about the fundamentally different rules that we need. But I'm just going to spend, I've not got long, so I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about how trade rules have done this. And then Sharon and Cecilia are going to talk about that in more depth. So I'm just going to categorize it in three ways. There's loads of ways you can categorize the impacts of trade agreements, but three ways. First of all, that they have been highly deregulatory. They have created a kind of race to the bottom in regulations and standards around the world. And that's where the famous chlorine chickens come in. I didn't know much about chlorine washed chicken when I started working on TTIP, but I learned about it, and I learned about the very, very different agricultural standards that exist in the United States to the ones that exist here in the European Union or in Britain now. And the problem with chlorine chicken isn't so much the chlorine, but that it allows a very unpleasant animal welfare or lack of animal welfare process to be concealed by kind of dunking a bird in a chlorine or chlorine-like wash at the end of its life. And this is a big challenge to the food standards that we've developed in this country over many years. Now, the problem with trade deals is they look at it only from one perspective, only from the perspective of me as a business. So say I'm a chlorine chicken producer in the United States, I say, but I can't export my goods into British markets, and therefore I lobby my government to say, look, in a trade deal, you need, this is about free trade, you need to allow me to export my goods into British markets. And so you come up with all sorts of ways of trying to claim within the trade deal that goods are equivalent, that this chicken that you're producing is the same as chicken that's produced in Britain to different standards, and so we will allow them into the markets. This creates a massive problem for farmers here because they're still having to produce chicken to a higher standard. They can't compete with the industrially produced chicken that's coming in, and so they have to put pressure on our government to reduce standards here, and it creates this downward pressure on regulations and standards. And Sharon will have loads of examples of what this might mean in practice in a US trade deal, but broadly this is how many trade deals work. And these things are termed, I mean, the standards and regulations that we kind of fight for and like in many cases are termed non-tariff barriers. And modern trade deals are all about non-tariff barriers far more than they are about tariffs. I mean, we are in a traditional sense, we have pretty much free trade with the United States already. I mean, you could reduce a few tariffs here and there, but by and large, we've got a pretty much a free trade relationship with the United States. But now it's about reducing these regulation standards and protections that many of us have fought for a long time. So that's one. Number two is services. Services is massive now, and services is basically anything you can't drop on your foot. So it goes from finance and insurance and telecommunications right through to what we would regard as public services. And that's where the NHS comes in. The danger for us of a trade deal with the US is not that the day after it's ratified, a big corporation is going to come in and just buy the whole of the NHS as if it were a single building. It's that within that trade deal, there is very, very likely to be a number of clauses that push in the direction of more liberalization and more privatization. Clauses known as standstill clauses or ratchet clauses, which will lock in the marketization that's already been committed to in the NHS, and which I suspect most British people do not like and do not want, and make it much more difficult for a future government to undo that marketization and privatization. And thirdly, and this is something, part of what Cecilia is going to talk about, I know, I mean, to some degree, modern trade deals have simply become corporate charters, essentially. I mean, they just allow corporations and financiers enormous privileges to go where they want in the world, behave as they want in the world, and then when they've done exploiting, removing their profits and bringing them back to the financial center. And we can see that in intellectual property provisions, a massive problem at the moment with coronavirus, when we believe we need patents to be medicines to be produced patent-free. That's all the more difficult under trade deals, which have enforced a certain standard, a certain length of time that corporations can enjoy monopolies over their products, and that prices out many, many people in the world from essential medicines. There are digital trade chapters. This is quite a new thing in trade deals. They're called e-commerce chapters, which essentially is about handing huge power to the big tech industry. In Silicon Valley, you'll have seen that Trump is not at all happy about attempts in various European countries to introduce digital services taxes to try and tax these giants who are so difficult to tax. He's saying that would be incompatible with terms I want to introduce in a trade deal. So again, giving massive powers to an already extremely powerful industry. And finally, what Cecilia's going to talk about, which is this corporate court system, which I won't say too much about, but I mean, it's essentially a parallel legal system for foreign investors to challenge pretty much anything they don't like about government regulation. And all government regulation is likely to have some impact on big corporations and I mean, that's often the point of it, we hope. So the idea you can challenge that in a secret parallel process and sue governments for acting in the public interest is just an enormous problem to the sovereignty of many countries and to government's ability to work in the public interest and in the environmental interest. So we need a fundamentally different set of rules. We need to stop this forced liberalization, this path of liberalization and deregulation, which is the essence of modern trade deals. And we need to think about how we can use international economic rules to actually constrain, control, and regulate capital and businesses. And maybe we can get on to talking about some of that in the questions. But the most important thing is to defeat this US deal, which I know we're going to come back to, because not only is it bad in itself, but I think if we defeated this deal, and I really believe we can, it would be just the most enormous setback for the free trade liberalization agenda of this government, and would allow us to get on the front foot in terms of calling for some of the economic reforms that we need at a global level. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. That's a really good sort of outline of why it is that trade deals are a problem. Just to remind, if we'll hear from each of the speakers first, and then we'll do some Q&A. If you have questions for the speakers, there's a Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen, so you can type in questions there. So now we have Sharon, who is going to talk to us a bit about more about that US-UK trade deal and what the risks are, what it is that the US government wants out of it. Sharon works for the Institute of Agriculture and Trade Policy in the US. She's the senior attorney there. Previously, she was a legislator in the Maine legislature. And that's where she first got interested in trade. And it also means that she's got an insight into how the trade deals get done from the inside, because she's seen some of the processes, she's been on some of the committees, she's seen the things happening, and she still sees some of the things happening. So Sharon, it'd be wonderful if you can tell us a bit about, what is the US's agenda? What do they want to get out of a trade deal?
Okay, first I need to share my screen. So, because I have some slides, so don't start timing me yet, or I'm in serious trouble. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see that. And if you wait just a second, I'm going to move something that's on my screen that's blocking my view. Okay, so yes, I'm Sharon Tree. I'm with the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy, and we've been working on trade issues for over 30 years and agriculture and how the two go together. And I'm going to talk about some of the risks that a trade deal with the United States and the UK could pose Now there's many risks. Nick's mentioned quite a few of them. I'm only going to mention really three things primarily. One is relating to weaker food quality standards and environmental protections. One has to do with deregulation of genetic engineering and labeling of that and everything else pretty much. And then thirdly, a little bit about the NHS issues, which I actually got into, especially when I was a legislator, but we care about that at ITP too, because it's about our entire society and how we survive and thrive. How do we know what the US wants to do? Well, it's actually said so pretty clearly. And here I've taken some text directly out of what the US has said it wants. It wants to get rid of these terrible, unwarranted barriers to trade. Those are the non-tariff barriers that Nick was talking about. It wants to require science-based rules. I'm going to get into that in a little detail. It's mentioned unregulating GMOs, and particularly anything that's quote an innovative or new technology, and also what they want to do on medical devices and prices. Well, this language actually mimics and carries forward, as Nick said, is the corporate agenda. And here we see what Big Agriculture wants. These are comments that they submitted to the US government and what they wanted to see. If you go to the middle one, that's talking specifically about pesticide residues. And there's 82 pesticides that the US allows to be on the market that have been banned in the EU and are also not used, obviously, in the UK at this point. PRTs, that's chlorine chicken. That's in the third comment, and growth promotion, these drugs that are used in animals to get them to get to massive size very, very quickly, which again raise animal welfare, but also human health issues as well. Well, this is a slide just to kind of sum up of sort of on the top, we have how the US sets standards. On the bottom, we have some of these issues that we've just been discussing. I think the main thing I want to point out here is that what's the difference between so-called risk-based standards and science-based standards that the US uses versus the precautionary principle. The thing I would focus on, I mean, there's a lot of things that go into this, but the number one thing to me is that it really changes the burden of proof, that instead of being on industry to prove that their product is safe before it goes onto the market, it shifts the burden more onto the regulator to prove that it's too dangerous to be on the market. And as a result, in the US, we have many, many things that were grandfathered in and are allowed to be sold, whether it's food additives, pesticides, chemicals, and we can't get them off the market going forward. So what does it mean when we say science-based? One of the things that's really important, I mean, this is false dichotomy that the US government and industry sets up, and it basically says the precautionary principle isn't science or scientific, and we use science. Well, it's not an either or scenario, and this is actually really Orwellian language, in my opinion, which is intended to support what is basically an industry agenda started by the tobacco industry, which came up with this sound science. And the idea is, you throw so much stuff out there that it's impossible to figure out what is true and what isn't. And there's like so many studies, and there's always more studies that you can look at, and they're industry studies that say, well, it's really not clear. We just don't have enough information to regulate. And that's what happens in the US. And I think one of the things that's really important takeaway I would have for you is that recent free trade agreements that the US has had, including the USMCA, which it is using as the template, that's the agreement with Canada and Mexico as the template for the UK one, actually require the other countries that are part of these agreements to have these kinds of US risk-based, or I would say risky, standard setting. Well, what that means is this is not just about importing US products that you don't like into the UK. It's about importing the US system for deciding what's safe and what should be on the market into the UK. And the other thing is that when they're talking about science, they're not necessarily talking about the kind of science that you and I might think is, objective peer-reviewed science. It's very often industry studies. And in the US, so there's a lot of decision-making that goes into regulations that's based on industry studies. And one of the really pernicious things that's happening also inside of trade deals is moving a practice that we already have in the United States, which is calling anything that the industry submits practically as confidential business information, not available to the public, not available to have peer review. This is what they're basing their chemical and pesticide and food additive products on. And then they're putting into the trade agreements that the other countries, as well as the US, must label everything CBI, and they can get out of providing it to the public. So what does this mean? It means that you get an application for a chemical to go onto the market. And this is, so your public interest group says, okay, what was it based on when you said this is fine for the public? And you get back this blacked out agreement that says, well, everything's confidential business information, so we can't really tell you what the basis of it is. And it also allows industry to kind of cherry pick what they want. So if they have data that shows that people are actually getting sick or cancer from, say, a pesticide residue, that's not necessarily information that gets submitted to the federal government in support of their application. Well, related to all of this is the GMO issue, and I just want to point out, we already were sort of unregulated in the US, and now the US has a new regulation that says that companies can decide for themselves whether or not gene editing and other genetic engineering techniques need to be overseen by the government. And I can imagine what they're going to say. Obviously, they're not going to ask for it to be regulated. And on his first day as Prime Minister, Boris Johnson vowed to take down the same path. So, and here's just a slide to show some of the products that are allowed on the US market without that kind of oversight, that are gene edited, CRISPR stuff. So you can look at that. So, this is the Daily Mail, but I just want to point out that the Wall Street Journal has the same point of view. This was a quote that they said in January, they just said, it's inevitable that you're going to see food and other products that are currently illegal as imported into the UK in a trade deal. That's what you're going to see. And I would agree with that. So let's just switch topics a little bit and get into briefly the healthcare issues. I've heard the slogan, the NHS isn't on the table. This is part of, the UK negotiating objectives, but what does that really mean? Well, it doesn't get into details, as Nick has already pointed out, about drug pricing and patent law. And one of the things I really want to focus on is the drug pricing issue. This is something that is, again, it's sort of Orwellian language that's not very clear. It says, we're going to ask for transparency. Well, what does that mean? That means, quote, competitive market-based pricing. What's that? Well, your NHS or any other government can't go out and do price setting or, do reference pricing. You're supposed to base prices on, quote, what the competitive market is, i.e. what it is in the United States, where we don't have price regulation, or even the price that, a consumer would go in who had no health insurance whatsoever would be the highest possible price, not even the price that was negotiated by an insurance company. And again, also trying to extend monopoly pricing as long as possible, particularly for these biologics that are extremely expensive and are becoming a bigger and bigger part of the whole healthcare budget, both in the UK and the US. And this is White House policy. This is a report that came out from the White House saying the way we reduce drug prices in the United States is to go off these terrible foreign governments that are able to set drug prices at a lower level. This is terrible. We need to get rid of it. And of course, the way to get rid of it is through the trade deal between the US and the UK, at least starting there with the UK. And here is the Pharmaceutical Research Association, which is the big trade association for drug companies, saying, targeting the NHS and the procedures that the NHS uses in order to set drug and also medical device prices are part of this, and saying that these are unjustified. You shouldn't be able to look at whether something is actually cost effective. You shouldn't be able to have these proactive national procurement initiatives that are punitive. No, you should do what the United States does and have higher drug costs. And this is my next to last slide. It comes from a brand new article coming out of the British Medical Journal, which goes into these issues in a little detail in a short article. Very good. I highly recommend it. And here's a slide just showing what is the difference in price in the US and the UK for some major drugs, and that are, the top drugs that are used, or very expensive drugs. And basically, if you were to go to this US competitive pricing system, you're talking about billions and billions and billions of pounds of costs added on to the NHS and to UK taxpayers, and the related restrictions and less access to medicine and care, and from whether COVID or anything else going forward. And so, just in summary, just because the US is asking for all this stuff, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. But there's some worrying signs here. One of which is that if you look at what the UK said were it's governing its negotiations, it doesn't mention the precautionary principle, either with respect to what it's doing with the EU or the United States. And they're being very vocal about not wanting to agree to the standards that the EU has right now. The Ag Bill also did not really address this the way it could. We can talk about tariffs and whether that addresses the problem, but I would just say that when you have a trade agreement that's actually trying to import the whole way that regulations are made, putting a tariff on something is not going to address that, among other issues. And then, with the issues around NHS, I'm just, they've been very clear, NHS is not for sale, but that is a slogan. And it doesn't really address the specifics that are going to be in a trade deal. And in a trade deal, you are negotiating issues across, you negotiate digital versus prescription drugs versus agriculture versus all these other things. And what happens there could be anything. So I would not trust that necessarily. So I will wrap up with that. And there is my contact information, which will go out later. And I'll stop sharing so that
that's great,
somebody else
Sharon.
can speak.
Thank you so much. There was so much in there, and there were several people asking if we will share the slides later. So yes, Sharon has sent us a copy of her slides, so we should be able to share them, I think. I also just want to say at this point, so just before we move on to Cecilia, if you're interested in what we're just been talking about around the US trade deal, we'll get into some of the questions later, but also we've got an event coming up at the end of this month, and a sort of an online activist assembly where we want to try and get people together and talk a little bit about what are we going to do about this? How are we going to stop it? So maybe less about the issues, more about, right, what can we actually do? So I think my colleague who is invisible at the moment is going to share the link in the chat for that activist assembly. Yeah, so that's it. So if you are interested in that, do have a look, sign up, register. It's on the 27th of June, which is a Saturday at the end of the month. Be a sort of a couple of hours in the morning to try and come up with ideas. Okay, we're now going to turn to a third panelist, which is Cecilia Olivet from the Transnational Institute. Cecilia, in my view, knows everything about corporate courts and ISDS. She was at one point on a panel convened by the President of Ecuador to review Ecuador's corporate court treaties and try and sort out the problems with them. So she's going to talk to us a bit about, yeah, ISDS and COVID. So Cecilia, can you explain to us why is it that actually we might get more ISDS cases as a result of the pandemic?
Yeah, so thanks for the invitation. It's great to see so many people here. I'm just going to share also my screen for a little presentation. 1 second. Here we are. Wait. So I'm not going to speak as fast as Sharon and Nick because I can't. So I hope, yeah, I also don't go over time. So we've been denouncing the impact of international investment agreements for more than a decade now. But somehow the COVID-19 pandemic has taken the dangers of investment treaties and this mechanism that allows investors to sue state at these corporate courts or international arbitration tribunals to a whole different level. And it has put us on edge, and that's what we've been seeing the last couple of weeks in particular. And we've done a little bit of research on it, so I wanted to share with you, not to scare you, but yes, to alert you on these new threats that are coming from a regime that was already very dangerous, and now is sort of, yeah, we see it even, more so. So what we are seeing is that, and witnessing is, this possible threat of a new wave of investor lawsuits against states over pandemic measures. So law firms and foreign investors are preparing to use around the world. We have 2,600 investment protection treaties that exist worldwide, and they can be used, any of those, to sue governments for the social and economic measures that governments have been taking to alleviate the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. I also wanted to put the data on the UK. I mean, UK has already enforced 91 bilateral investment treaties. So these are 91 bilateral investment treaties that both UK-based corporations can use to sue other governments, or the investors from the other governments with whom these treaties are part could also sue the UK government. But we know that the biggest impact is always on the global south, because it follows the flows of foreign investment. So it's more likely that an UK investor would sue a country in Latin America, Asia, or Africa than the other way around. So how do we know that this is likely to happen? I mean, are we just shouting something that is it's imaginary? Well, we don't think so, and I just want to give a little bit of evidence of that. First of all, this is not us predicting that this boom could, or this wave could happen. It's actually the international law firms that specialize in investment protection and that make most of their income from this type of lawsuits that are expecting a boom in cases as a result of the crisis. So they do see this crisis as an opportunity, and in their own words, they've been saying that it will boost the virtues of investment arbitration. At least 20 international law firms have published legal briefings or have organized webinars advising their corporate clients how they could sue for pandemic measures, meaning like they've been producing all these, briefings where they give all sorts of examples, and I will mention a few. But it's interesting, and I also wanted to share this one journalist that followed this story. There's the link to the report we published on this. But this German journalist contacted one of the law firms and asked, and confronting them with this argument, and what their reply was, well, we were not suggesting investors should sue governments. We were just providing information on how they could do it. And I think that's, it's very telling about how law firms are approaching the issue and the hypocrisy around it. And this is just one of, the hundreds of quotes that we extracted from these briefings. And again, it's very telling in itself. So these law firm Linklaters, was saying foreign investors need to be aware that states do not have free rein to disregard their investment treaty obligations, notwithstanding the severity of the crisis faced. Meaning, yes, we know you are in crisis, but you still have to obey to what you agree on these international investment treaties that you sign on to. So again, this is, their warning. The law firms are warning that this is likely to happen and will happen. A second way we know this is likely to happen is because it has happened before. And the law firm's predictions are not based on fiction. They also have been already involved in all of these cases during previous crises, because many of these previous crises have resulted in ISDS cases. And just to mention a few, like Argentina's economic crisis of 2001, the Arab Spring, the financial crisis of 2008, all of these have resulted in many investors suing governments as a result of the measures taken. In particular, the case of Argentina, I think, is very telling, because at the time of the crisis, the governments that the government of Argentina took measures like freezing utility rates or restructuring their sovereign debt bonds. And these are measures that governments are also taking today. And during the Argentina crisis, those same measures led to 42 lawsuits by investors. Many of them have already been resolved, and they have been decided in favor of the investors, despite Argentina claiming that it was an economic crisis, they had to do it, there was no way around it, and still the arbitrators that decided the case sided with the investors in order Argentina to compensate for millions of US dollars. So again, law firms, themselves saying that investment arbitration often follows economic, financial, or other crisis, just reaffirms what they expect and what has been happening. And finally, there's still no actual cases that have come out as a result of COVID-19 measures, but there's already threat of ISDS lawsuits, of corporate lawsuits. For example, against Peru. Peru suspended the collection, this was one of the measures the government took, to temporarily suspend the collection of highway tolls to protect the employees, but also to ease the transport of food and other essential goods. And immediately this led to law firms and some investors saying, well, we will explore, but this is a measure that we consider could lead to lawsuits. So just to be a bit more concrete, what are the law firms saying that could result in this type of lawsuits? And the list is really, enormous, and it could go anyway, but just to give you some examples. So prevent cuts to water, gas, and electricity due to lack of payment. We know that some governments have been saying, well, in this time, we cannot have citizens, especially vulnerable citizens, with their electricity, their gas, or their water being cut because they cannot pay. So we're going to put a freeze on that. Well, this type of measure could definitely result in cases. In fact, measures, for example, taken by Bolivia and El Salvador in that regard have been mentioned in particular and specifically by the law firms, arguing that foreign utility investors could challenge that type of measures because they eliminated their revenue streams. Measures like what Spain did and Ireland, I think also temporary use private hospitals to treat corona patients because their hospitals the public hospitals couldn't cope. Measures to make sure that pharmaceutical companies do not profiteer from drugs, from tests, and particularly from the vaccines needed to for COVID-19 treatment so these are also measures that have been warned could lead to lawsuits. And some others, even some that the UK government have taken, like a moratorium on evictions and freezing of mortgage payments, and the restructuring of foreign debt, which in 2001 was already measured that Argentina took and led to many lawsuits, and now there are warnings that it could lead to the same outcome. So more concretely, what are the main consequences of all this for governments? Well, first and foremost, the main risk I would say is governments having to pay millions of dollars, euros, pounds from their already precarious public budgets. This is taxpayers' money that would be diverted away from other needs like public health, like access to food, like employment creation, particularly in a time of crisis. And I think in particular, the governments in the global south that are already feeling the burden of, for example, financial, the debt, the foreign debt burden, and there's been calls, international calls for relief of that, would have to be, dealing with this type of cost at this time. So just to give you a little bit an idea also of the amounts we are talking about, we know, for example, that there are 13 cases worldwide that have already resulted in governments having to pay over $1 billion just for one case. So, you know, we're talking about astronomical amount of money that can really put a dent on public budgets. A second risk goes beyond the issue of money, and it's about what we call regulatory chill. This is governments shying away from advancing certain regulation that, you know, measures that could alleviate people's needs because of the risk of being sued and because of the risk of having to pay this enormous amount of money. So I also think that it's important to see this advising that the law firms are doing towards their own, you know, their clients, but it's also a warning for states, because what they're saying, you know, and some of them even very directly, it's like, watch out what type of measures you're taking, because these can lead to lawsuits. So we don't have, you know, it's very difficult to know when actually governments shy away from these measures because of the threat of lawsuits, but the risk is certainly there. And finally, governments are risking that their sovereign decisions will be dragged into a system that is clearly not fit to deal with public interest cases, because the arbitrators that decide on these cases you know, have a more commercial interest in mind than a public interest in mind. So finally, what can governments do? There is already experts that have called, for example, for a restriction, a permanent restriction of the use of ISDS, or this investor to state mechanism, corporate courts, for COVID-19 related measures. But there's, and this is more like an immediate relief, right? Like, it's so outrageous that these type of cases could happen that, you know, we at least need to restrict that possibility. But more structurally, you know, governments should just stop negotiating, signing, or ratifying these type of treaties, and they should start the process of terminating the existing agreements. I mean, the only way to really prevent cases in the long run is to get out of this system. And yeah, I just wanted to finish with this quote from one of the international institutes that have been doing a lot of work on this issue, and it's, you know, the need to avoid this type of claims is clearly yeah, more urgent than ever. So action on these issues is needed. And there is some process at the international level to have a letter to address to governments. Global Justice Now has been part of that process, but I leave Jean to talk maybe a little bit more, and maybe it's an issue that we'll be addressing what we can do about it later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. I could see several people in the chat there saying, yeah, I mean, that's really scary, but that's, yeah, it's really good to hear about the risks that are out there. Okay, we've got some questions that are in, and I think several have just come in recently. If you have any questions for the panelists, do put them in the Q&A. So one of the things that has been, a couple of people have been asking that maybe, is about why do we, what would be the benefit, or what would be the risk of actually just not having a deal with the US, which is one of the things I think I quite often find this, that there's a distinction between trade and a trade deal. So we trade with the US. Does it matter if we don't have a deal with the US? Do any of you want to come in on that?
Well, I mean, maybe Nick can speak from his point of view, but, you know, everything that I've seen, first of all, he already mentioned that tariffs generally are quite low. So, you know, a lot of what the US wants is in this non-tariff area, which is really about changing regulation. So that's a decision for the UK government and people to decide if that's really what you want. But if you do, you don't need to have a trade agreement with the United States to decide how to change your regulations to be different from how they are. My perception on this is that this is very much the interest in this trade deal is very much a political interest on the part of both Boris Johnson and Donald Trump, both of which, for perhaps different reasons, want to be able to waive this agreement. And, one, coming out of Brexit and saying now we're, independent country, we can do these great deals with the United States. And then Donald Trump, who says every deal he does is a great deal and has a lot of political problems right now and would like to be able to say, well, we've just achieved this great deal, regardless of what's in it. And I think that's what you see. I mean, a lot of what's in here are things that's proposed to be in here, and certainly is in the agreement with Canada and Mexico, are really very harmful because they make it almost impossible to actually improve environmental protections and labeling of foods and consumer goods and things like that. And so, I'm just not seeing the benefits. And I think there's a lot like what's going on right now in response to the pandemic and trying to come up with ways of sharing information and funding around medicines that can be done outside of a trade agreement. It's still international activism, but it's not involved in this kind of restrictive corporate-driven trade agreement.
Yeah, and I think that the really important thing there is because, yeah, it's true, not everybody gets this. We're not saying if we don't do this trade deal, we won't be trading any more goods with the United States. We'll be trading goods with the United States as we do at this moment. It's not the case that you won't be able to buy any more American goods on your shelves. Unless, of course, Trump decides he's going to impose some tariffs or something like this in hostility, which he's want to do. But by and large, it's the difference between doing a trade deal, which is about all these other issues, and normal trading of goods, which of course would continue.
As a couple of people, that I think this is a question maybe for Nick, asking sort of, well, yeah, the cover, because I think it's clear to everybody that the UK pursuing negotiations with the US at the same time as pursuing negotiations with the EU is in itself, there's a political reason for that. And the balance between, doing a deal with the EU versus doing a deal with the US.
Yeah, it's really interesting to look at the difference in approach to those two negotiations. And it's different, even just at a level of rhetoric. I mean, I'm not aware of another trade deal in history where the rhetoric going into the trade deal has been as negative as it is on the EU deal. I mean, really, some of the stuff our negotiators have come out with is absolutely extraordinary. It's like, why the hell are you doing this deal if that's how you feel about each other? It's really extraordinary. And I think it's, the government is at pains to say, we do not need this deal. And in many ways, we don't even want this deal. Whereas with the US, there is extremely warm language, like all the normal talk that you get in trade negotiations around these amazing benefits that would result from this deal. Completely different tone that's taken, despite the fact, of course, that our economy is far more integrated with the European markets than with the US markets. So the theory behind this at the beginning was that if you go for both at the same time, you'll be able to leverage kind of trade-offs, and you'll be able to say, well, if you don't give us this, then Europe will, or America will, or what, I mean, the idea that the British government, with its unbelievable lack of competence across the board, actually, but certainly in this area, will be able to harness those kind of trade-offs with two of the most hard-nosed trading blocs in the world, I think is incredibly naive. And the real worry that comes out for me is absolutely, like Sharon said, this is all political. And actually, what a lot of the push for Brexit from those leading the campaign, not for people who voted from it, but the leaders of the campaign for Brexit in Parliament, was all about taking this opportunity to free ourselves from the shackles of Europe and really go full out on liberalisation and deregulation. And the wonderful advantage for them of doing a trade deal with the United States is, as Sharon put it really well, they can import elements of the US regulatory system into Britain. And the elements of that regulatory system where it is all about deregulation and all about liberalization is precisely what these people have wanted to do for a very long time. So to my mind, it is absolutely true that they want to do as small a deal with the EU as possible. I mean, what previously we would have called no deal, really. And they want to do this deal with the US precisely because they know it will lock in some of what these people have dreamt about their whole lives, this kind of becoming this kind of free market haven in the North Atlantic.
Thanks. Now, just say, we have at the minute got 27 questions to get through. So I'm going to group some of these together a little bit, but just to give people, there's a huge number of questions and interests. As a group of questions that are many around ISDS, which I'm going to ask Cecilia to take a first shot at, which are these kinds of questions that I think people quite often sort of have. Why did government sign them in the first place? If it's called investment protection, who's it supposed to be protecting? Why would you pay these fines? How on earth do people assess the amounts involved? Because somehow it always seems to be more than the amounts that actually have been spent. So yeah, if you could help on that, Cecilia.
Yeah. So that's the question we still continue to ask. Why are you signing on to this? So in the, the bulk of these treaties was signed back in the 90s. And at that time, the consensus, I mean, in terms of the voices, right? What you would hear from international institutions, from academics, from all the government officials was like, if you want to attract foreign direct investment, this is the type of treaty you need to sign, because this will give the sign to foreign investors and the security, and it would help you, and that this is the path to development. So under this, general belief, most governments around the world signed to these type of treaties. And as I said, the 90s, the Washington Consensus era was when the bulk of this type of treaties was signed. Now, if we fast forward 30 years later, until today, what we have is actually a situation where on the one hand, the benefits, let's say, of these treaties have not materialized, because it's proven that there is no correlation between signing this type of treaties and attracting foreign direct investment. But the risks and the dangers and the impact, the negative impacts have become very clear. Yet governments continue to negotiate and sign at a much slower pace than before, but still, I mean, okay, now the US-UK deal, as far as I understand, Jean, correct me, but it doesn't include an investment protection chapter. Well, still not, okay, it
might.
Okay, but it was part of the TTIP discussions. It is in the CETA agreement, and it's in many agreements that Europe and the UK is planning to negotiate. And as I said, the UK has these 91 investment treaties that are in place. So to respond to the question, why are governments still signing to it? At this stage, I would say, it's ideology. There's still this belief, and I mean, it has, it's been repeated, but with no evidence, still by the European Commission and by, even the UK government and the US government to a certain extent, that you need to sign to these treaties to attract foreign direct investment. The evidence is not there, but just in case that it would help. I mean, but it goes hand in hand with the belief that you need foreign direct investment to develop. And this is, the panacea, like to get foreign direct investment at whatever cost. And it doesn't matter if it's regulated, if it's not regulated, in which form it comes, as long as we have it, this is the path to development. And this is, still a belief that I think leads countries to continue signing, though there is also countries that are getting out and that are terminating this type of treaty. So there was one of the questions, could the UK government terminate or review? Yes, they can. I mean, all of these treaties actually include a clause that allows governments to get out. It's politically difficult. There's a lot of pressure for governments that did it and that tried to do it, but it is there, it's legal, and it's definitely an option. And finally, there was a question of what happened if governments refuse to pay. Well, this is, I mean, we have an enormous amount of international legal treaties on the environment, on labor rights, on indigenous rights, on many other issues, but none of them have what we would call teeth. I mean, in general, these are like soft law type of treaties. They don't have an enforceability mechanism. These treaties, international investment protection treaties, are enforceable. So they are enforceable through the arbitration tribunals that decide on these cases, but then that award that the arbitrators finally release, any investor can go to a national court around the world and say, if a government refuses to pay, can say, I have here, this piece of paper that I want to get my money. And most national courts around the world will actually allow for the investor to seize the assets of governments to get their money from these awards. So it's a very strong and enforceable mechanism. And in terms of the amounts, yes, they are astronomical, and they are because investors can claim not just what they invested and let's say they lost, but also the future expected profits. So let's say an investor goes into a country for a mining project. It does an initial exploration, it invests $100,000, but then something happens, the project doesn't continue, and then they say, well, but we were expecting to earn, in the 10 or 15 or 20 years that we were planning to have this project, hundreds of millions. So this is what we're claiming for, and this is allowed. And arbitrators are the ones that decide on the amounts, and they usually, don't give 100% what the investors ask for, but they also go much beyond what the initial investments have been. So it's a perverse system in that way.
Yeah, very perverse. Just to clarify, ISDS has certainly been discussed in the negotiations on the US-UK trade deal. Somebody was asking, what do we know? One of the things we know is there were preparatory talks that have taken place over the last 2 years, and the documents from those leaked at the end of last year. And the leaks shown that they had been discussing including corporate courts, ISDS, in quite a lot of detail. Now, on both sides, the objectives are not completely explicit about this. They both sort of say, we want our companies to have protection without giving undue protection to the other side's company. So they've kind of left a sort of a space where they would go. But so far as we're concerned, until they rule it out, we believe they're still talking about including ISDS. Is that, Sharon, would you agree with that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I was just going to say that particularly on the UK side, they were sort of coy in saying, yes, we understand there's a lot of discussion about ISDS. I mean, this is in their negotiating objectives, and then they don't take any position on it. So they haven't done a clear red line. And even though the US scaled back ISDS in the agreement between Canada and Mexico, there still is ISDS in there, particularly with respect to Mexico. And as Jean said, if you read through those leaked documents, you see that the negotiators, which are the same negotiators that are, negotiating today, this agreement, are saying, well, there's a lot of, useful things about ISDS, and we shouldn't take it off the table. So there's a little bit of a disconnect there. So we don't really know, what's going to happen, on that or on anything. And I think there have been some question about, just how things are going. I mean, one thing I can say is that the US and the UK are negotiating at speed on all of these topics all at once. And we're talking about 30 plus different chapters that they are negotiating and actually planning to sit down and review text, as I understand it, in the next round. And certainly the US is well prepared with that test. I don't know where the UK is in terms of offering up its positions and, actually working from their documents and their premises compared to working off the US template.
Yeah, that's something you alerted us to, Sharon, and we've been trying to get some MPs to ask questions because we have this worrying feeling that all the UK is doing is reacting to what the US is proposing, and not making its own proposals. There's a group of questions now that I think it can be a bit of a discussion. So sort of the basic question, how do we stop the US deal? And then people asking, what are the hooks? What are the pressure points? Is there something that in the UK with the red wall that became the blue wall, the seats that went from Labour to Tory, are there promises that were made there that could be used in the campaigning? Windows of opportunity at the moment, the agriculture bill maybe was lost, but is there space to do something in the trade bill? The groups involved, health groups, farming groups, climate groups, all have reasons to be concerned about this. So I don't know, Nick, do you want to sort of first say maybe a bit about some of that?
Yeah, and maybe to justify some of my optimism on this, although I'm not in any way saying it's going to be easy, but first of all, it's worth saying parliamentarians have broadly no power over trade policy at all. We are trying to change that, but by and large, MPs cannot stop this trade deal. They can't see the negotiating papers, so we don't know what's in them unless they get leaked. And they have very, very little opportunity to hold the government to account for what it's doing. So that's the first problem. So how may you say, could we stop this? Well, I think in some ways, I mean, TTIP is my model here, because let's bear in mind, although our MEPs did have more power than our MPs, at the very beginning of the TTIP campaign, very few people really understood what we were worried about, and from politicians to the media, we had very few champions at a political level to begin with, and that changed very, very rapidly as we kind of, as campaigners, took hold of the narrative. And I have to say, I mean, Sharon's right. I mean, they're going very quickly, and this is a concern to us, but we're well ahead of where we were actually with TTIP. I mean, we already kind of controlled the narrative even before the negotiations formally started. I mean, you only have to say the words US trade deal, and chlorine chicken is almost the first thing that people think of and that springs to mind. And indeed, for everything that the government said about protecting food standards, many of you have already commented on the news story yesterday that in fact the chlorine chicken and other foods will be allowed in to the UK under this trade deal, just with high tariffs, and Sharon's talked about some of the problems with that. But I actually think in terms of those kind of touch point issues that people really get, food and the NHS have got to be absolutely front and foremost. I mean, that's how we're going to get to very large numbers of people who are not used to getting involved in these kind of campaigns. And I have to say, and I hope they hold their nerve, I don't know if they will, but the National Farmers Union, who we don't always work with, that have actually done some great stuff in terms of getting local farmers around the country agitated about this, writing to their MPs, often Tory MPs, and writing to their local newspapers. And that's actually created a little disgruntled group of Tory MPs in Parliament, which you wouldn't normally expect this early after a government had just won a majority, who are already prepared to vote against the government on this trade deal. So that's pretty exciting. The agriculture secretary on his first day of office was booed by a set of farmers as soon as he mentioned the US trade deal. So that's an exciting level of awareness that people have already got. I think we can definitely talk to a slightly more informed audience about the ISDS stuff as well, because it's just an atrocious violation of our democratic rights, and anybody who hears about it is normally absolutely horrified. I think for online activists, talking about some of the digital stuff could be really big, because I think it will be extreme in this deal. So I think that will be really useful as well. And I think through and remember as well, there are going to be massive contradictions at the level of the negotiators. So we're not the only ones creating problems here. I mean, there will be inbuilt problems, like I've already talked about with the digital services tax, like the decision about Huawei and 5G. There are already huge tensions between the governments, and I think our job as activists can force those into the light. And essentially leads to a kind of just a collapse in the political will to get this through by the end of the year. So that's where I hope. And the only small thing I would just say at the end of that is that the fear for me is actually that doing a trade deal with Trump is kind of makes it easy for us, right? Because he's really not well liked in Britain, even on the right of the political spectrum. So doing a trade deal with Trump is not something people want in general, including many people who voted Brexit in the red wall seats. There was some opinion polling a few weeks ago that actually there was a lot of support for regulation, environmental regulation, and animal welfare regulation amongst young leavers in the north of England. So that's really good. My worry is if Trump loses the election later in the year, and I hope he does, that all of a sudden we have a president who looks nicer and talks nicer, and everybody says, oh yeah, we can do a trade deal with him, when actually the content will be very, very similar. And I think that's where we will have our work cut out.
Maybe I could just go to that point, because I did see one of the questions asking about, well, what if Joe Biden gets elected? And you need to remember Joe Biden was the vice president when Obama was pushing the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the TTIP, which have a lot of all this stuff. I mean, the USMCA, the agreement with Canada and Mexico, actually tries to go beyond both of those agreements. So it's like even worse in a lot of the things that I've been talking about, but both of those were really bad. And so, you know, I don't think it's a given that just because it's a different president, they'll be taking a really different track. I do think, I will say this, he has some good people advising him right now. And he's put together a team with the Sanders supporters that's really trying to come up with plans for how, and kind of changing his views from some of what I've seen in terms of what the US should be doing coming out of the pandemic in particular. So it may be that this moment with the pandemic allows people in the US to understand a lot better about how, you know, what these trade deals are doing, and allows someone like Biden, who's sort of gone along with this overall vision of trade, you know, solving all of our problems, and you know, all of these trade rules being part of a trade deal, might have a different point of view. I did also want to just say one other thing to what Nick was saying about chlorine chicken and other stuff. I do think it's very important, though, not to get too sucked into particular like chlorine chicken, because there's a lot of other things that are used that aren't chlorine that are equally bad, and that the whole system is equally bad. And I know it's a good way of representing what is not a good food safety system, but on the other hand, what you then see is some wordsmithing that makes sure that something that is being phased out anyway isn't, you know, what is imported into the UK, but all this other stuff like treated with parasitic acid, which actually is quite dangerous to workers, could be. So that's my only caution there. I think it's great that people are really aware of these issues already, but that is one of the concerns to just be paying attention to as you go forward with the messaging.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we often say we need to talk about things other than chlorine chicken and the NHS, because there are so many other issues around, well, even just in food standards, you've got issues around ractocamine in pork, hormone-fed beef. Yeah. You've got issues around pesticides, their impact both on food safety, things like pesticide residues in baby food, let alone the impact on biodiversity and the environment. You've got the climate impacts, you've got impacts of digital. There are so many things. But we do still keep getting headlines about chlorine chicken.
Well, and just a point about climate, you know, the US Congress, which at the time was 100% controlled by the Republicans, passed the trade negotiating overall legislation that expires in a year or two, but it's called Fast Track, and it's like how Congress oversees trade. And in that, it forbids the government from including climate-related provisions in any trade deal at all. And you will see that the negotiating objectives that for the UK deal, exclude that as well. So that's just another point that, it's both a substantive point of what could be really bad about a trade deal, making it harder to respond to climate change, but also it's a messaging point, which I know people really do care about addressing climate impacts. And so, the fact that a US trade deal would make it more difficult to do so is, I think, an important point to maybe be raising with people.
We've already gone over the hour. I think maybe there are so many questions. Maybe I'll just throw a couple more in, but before I do that, I could maybe just sort of give a couple of one-word answers to a few of them. Also, James, would it be possible to put the link to the Activists Assembly again in the chat, because I saw somebody asking for it. Somebody saying, saw a tweet that chlorine chicken won't be labeled. Yes, washing stuff in chlorine is a processing aid, not an ingredient, so it doesn't need to be labeled. So you wouldn't necessarily know. Working with activists in the US, yes, a little while back we got together with groups like Sharon's and others in the US and did a transatlantic statement around our opposition from both sides, civil society on both sides of the Atlantic, to this corporate-led deal, and had a whole range of groups sign on to that and send that to the Congress and to Parliament. Maybe a couple more, maybe sort of general things just to sort of throw out. So somebody asking around, will COVID sort of lead to more sustainable, shorter production chains? Can we actually find a way, as a result of the pandemic, of building a better trading system out of this? Somebody also raised the issue of carbon footprints of long chains. So I don't know if anybody would like to sort of say anything about that.
Well, the world of trade, the kind of ideology that's driven the global economy over the last 40 years is clearly changing, and it's losing massive amounts of support, especially in the West. And, figures like Trump have been able to popularize that and make political capital out of it. And I think the left has failed to do certainly has failed to do anything like as much as it should have done to create a new model. A trading system and an economy that works for people and not just big corporations and big finance and profits and so on. And that's what we need to do now. And if we don't do that, and if we just say we are going back to, neoliberal capitalism, and oh God, I mean, I'm so heartened to hear what you said, Sharon, about Biden, because I think it's absolutely vital. I mean, if we just have somebody who goes back to that 90s model of neoliberal capital, then, the far right just continues to grow because people are so turned off that now and they know it doesn't meet their needs. So we need a very different system, for sure. I mean, we're obviously thinking about this and what the alternatives could look like. There's some interesting stuff. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but I mean, there is some interesting stuff in the post-war settlement. In terms of how they looked at international economics. There was a treaty signed called the Havana Charter after the Second World War, and this was supposed to set up a kind of World Trade Organization. It didn't happen in the end. But it's really interesting. I mean, they're in favor of open markets, they're in favor of low tariffs by and large, but only as a means to achieving other social ends. I mean, at that time, full employment. I mean, that was the main thing that people were worried about because, it was seen that mass unemployment had led to fascism in the Second World War and so on. So they were, desperate to make full employment a reality. And they said, yeah, do all of this, lower your tariffs and open your markets, but only if it achieves this. If it doesn't achieve this, don't do it. If it doesn't achieve your development goals, don't do it. And I think this is really interesting that we need to look back at, for me, at trade rules which allow us to allow governments to control and constrain international capital and big business. Because, sure, there can be benefits from open markets. There can be benefits from trading with other countries, but the likelihood is if a government doesn't step in and redistribute those benefits so that everybody benefits from them in society, including those who may lose out from the trade deal, then those benefits will go up to the top. And that's the history of the last 40 years. You know, all of the benefits of the openness and the globalization that's been created have gone into the pockets of the super rich. And that's why we've got an economy like we've got now. And we need to have rules that allow governments to just stop that, to constrain the way that capital is allowed to behave in the way that it's allowed to behave today. And it's not impossible, right? Similar things have been done in the past.
Thanks. Sharon, do you want to have a sort of a last word? And then I give to Cecilia as well. Oh, you're muted, Sharon.
Yeah, I was just actually getting ready to respond to one of the questions about U.S. healthcare outcomes that someone asked, and they said, well, are U.S. outcomes, you know, worse or better? And they're much worse, and our costs are higher, and the level of bankruptcy just because people can't pay their healthcare bills. And I actually found out just like a Harvard study, I'll put it in the chat before it disappears, that gives you an academic report on just that. But so I think that is something to be concerned about. My last word would just be, I mean, I think this is something we need to absolutely focus on. From the US perspective, yes, there are activists like myself that are knowledgeable about this stuff and concerned about it, but I think in general, people look at the UK and say, we like the UK, we have this like relationship going back years and years, all the way to the Revolutionary War and before. So that's an okay thing, we don't need to worry about that. So that would be just a concern I have, that we do need to work on the US side for people to understand what the concerns are in the UK, but also in the US, which are these weird regulatory things that most people don't like, isn't the first thing that's talked about, you know? And it's kind of hard to talk about this stuff. So we need ways of explaining that and making that feel important to people in the US as well as in the UK.
Thanks. Cecilia? No, you're muted. No?
Sorry, I couldn't see the button. So we're getting, you know, it's end of the afternoon, getting tired. Sorry. Just also maybe wrapping up a few of the questions that were left, because I think there's one in particular that's very interesting, the issue of China. So there was a question, you know, does China sign this type of treaties? And, you know, in light that there is a lot of, FDI flowing out of China. And it's interesting because yes, I mean, they have a huge net of bilateral investment treaties, but most of their bilateral investment treaties actually, you know, either don't have the possibility of investors suing at all, or if they do, it's a very narrow possibility, only for if the government and the investor doesn't agree on the amount of the expropriation in case there was an expropriation. So it's very, 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 very narrow. So that's, for example, what's included in the UK-China bilateral investment treaty. So I think there are two conclusions out of that. One is that you don't need bilateral investment treaties like, you know, with all these protection for investors to attract foreign direct investment, for example, from China. And two, that, the reason why we also don't have maybe the, you know, actually there's almost none lawsuits from Chinese investors against states is because, these treaties are very restricted. So I just wanted to address that particular question. And then two final ones, maybe very shortly. The issue is how easy to terminate these treaties. As I was saying, it's easy in practice in the sense that, you know, it's just sending a letter saying that the government wants to terminate it. Now, politically, it's another story because we know that the pressures to terminate these treaties, it's very high, and governments, I mean, for example, the European Union has exerted enormous amount of pressure on governments like South Africa or Indonesia that, you know, when they took the decision to terminate theirs. But it has happened, and it is happening. So countries like, you know, I just wanted to mention the countries that have terminated their treaties so far, and this is India, South Africa, Indonesia, Ecuador, Bolivia, Tanzania, Italy, and most recently, all of the EU member states agreed to terminate all of their treaties among themselves. So there is enormous amount of precedent already of, this can be done and it's legal. Yet, of course, there is what we call the zombie clause in these treaties that says, governments terminate the treaty, but the protection for investors live on. And this is why we call it a zombie clause, because, the treaty is dead, but the protection continues. And this is problematic, and it's an issue, but we have to start somewhere. And at some point that protection expires as well. So we definitely advocate for the termination of these treaties, because there was another question, do they only protect investors? Yes, these are investment protection treaties. They don't protect states. Only investors can sue, not the other way around. So just to say, in relation to what Nick was indicating of what do we need, we need treaties, trade agreements that regulate investment, not that give them investors even more protections. And we already know that these treaties have no benefits, so there is no place for them. There's nothing that we need to put in place of this type of treaties. We just need to get rid of it.
That's a very good, yes, all we need to do is get rid of them. I want to say thank you to the panelists. It's been a great discussion. I'm sorry, we had like more than 40 questions, I think about 48 questions. So I'm sorry that we haven't been able to answer all of them. I just want to sort of end with sort of looking forward, some things that can be done. There's a bill going through Parliament at the moment, the trade bill, which, there's a possibility of trying to get some things into there that might give Parliament more of a say. With the numbers in Parliament, it's not that likely, but on the other hand, there are some unhappy Tory farmer MPs at the moment. So we will be asking you about that. The global sign-on letter that Cecilia mentioned when she was talking about the wave of cases from the pandemic. We will be asking GGN supporters to send that when it's ready to MPs to make sure that everybody knows about it. And again, the activist assembly on the 27th of June to try and have some more planning and talk about how to stop the trade deal. In terms of these webinars, normally I would be saying one in about 2 weeks, but actually because of everything that's happening in the US at the moment, some of my colleagues have organized one at quite short notice, which is happening on Monday. And I think that James can put the link in the chat for that. So yeah, that's great. Hopefully you're all on our supported list, you will get our messages about this. If you're not, please do sign up. Please do join Global Justice Now if you can. And again, just to say thank you to the panelists and to all of you for all of the comments, the questions, and the really good discussion. Thank you.